Okay, go ahead, Steve.
Welcome, everyone, to today's open meeting of the NSB-NSF Commission on Merit Review. My name is Stephen Willard, chair of this commission, and I am accompanied by the commission's vice chair, Wanda Ward. The Commission on Merit Review is comprised of members from the National Science Board and the National Science Foundation. Let's start by taking a roll. Roger Beachy, unable to attend. Alicia Needler.
I'm here.
Steve Leith. Candace Major.
Here.
Matt Mulkin.
Here.
Sarah K. McDonald is excused. Julia Phillips.
Here.
Scott Stanley.
Here.
Kayvon Stassen. And Wanda Ward.
Here.
Our NSBO liaisons are Portia Flowers, Ann Bushmiller, and Alexandra Sochel. And we are also joined by Albert Einstein Distinguished Educator Fellows Danielle Taylor and Vida Trevino. Thank you all for such a productive meeting earlier this month. We covered a lot of ground discussing merit review criteria, elements, and principles at length. As Wanda and I said, that was just an introduction to the multiple aspects of merit review policy we must address. Specific to broader impacts, there were several topics that we'd like to follow up on in this meeting, including the issue of novelty, aggregation, evaluation, and potential for bias within the policy itself. So today we're going to dive deeper into broader impacts in hopes of identifying areas for inquiry for both internal and external stakeholders. We are grateful to have the director of the Center for Advancing Research Impact in Society, ARIS, Susan Reno, joining us today in this conversation. Susan is one of the foremost experts on broader impacts and is no stranger to NSF, having most recently served on committees of visitors panels and currently as a member of CIOS. Before we dive into our discussion, I'd like us to consider the results of our BI expert listening session held at the ARIS Summit back in March. In a previous meeting, Wanda provided a very brief summary of the findings. Today, however, she will provide a fuller look into the perspectives given by BI professionals and their suggestions for how to improve the BI criteria. Wanda, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Steve, and good morning to everyone. Very much appreciate being here this morning. And as Steve has indicated, we found the summit, the ARIS Summit, to be extremely informative. Moving forward, and I am actually pulling together some of the information that we want to share with you this morning. And I also want to join Steve in thanking and welcoming Susan for being with us this morning as I'm continuing to pull things together. So thank you for your patience. As is indicated on the slide, and I'm trying to adjust. I have a technological challenge here, but we are getting ourselves together here. Be with you momentarily as we move forward. So, as I did share in April, as well as during our report out to the board earlier this morning, this month that is, Steve and I had the opportunity to engage over 120 broader impacts experts and practitioners from around the country at the ARIS Summit in Baltimore. As I move forward, Our listening session lasted approximately 90 minutes and gave participants the option of submitting their answers anonymously through the Mentimeter survey tool or verbally. Next slide. We began the session by asking participants to describe their roles and responsibilities related to NSF's merit review process and review criteria. An overwhelming majority, 80% of participants indicated academic institutions as their place of employment, with most from R1 institutions, as you can see on the slide. The remaining 20% represented federal agencies, nonprofit or non-academic organizations, self-employment, or other. Next. We then asked participants to share their thoughts on the overall strengths and weaknesses of the BI criterion. As you can see in this word cloud, participants used words like societal benefit, community engagement, inclusive, required, broad, and accountability to describe the strengths of the criterion. In discussion, participants also gave NSF credit for making BI a requirement in proposals, as it encourages PIs and institutions to pay attention to BI in funded research. Next. As for weaknesses, participants used words like underfunded, unclear, inconsistent, undervalued, evaluation, and accountability, which interestingly appeared as a strength as well. So we'll have to look into that a bit further. In discussion, while the participants appreciated that the BI criterion is mandatory, it is still perceived as a checkbox measure for some PIs and institutions, as guidance on BI implementation remains unclear, and PIs are not held accountable for fulfilling their BI plans. Next. Accountability and evaluation was a consistent theme throughout the listening session. There was general consensus that institutions believe that the intellectual merit criterion impacts funding more than BI, and that there is variable BI training of evaluators. Participation as a measure of BI, and specifically, multiple participants suggested that NSF move beyond broadening participation as a measure of BI and specifically require evidence of productivity and tracking changes that have occurred as a result of the increased participation. Finally, respondents suggested that BI does not require novelty. In most cases, BI benefits from amplifying best practices already established. Next. Some suggestions for NSF for improvement in the accountability evaluation space include providing standardized guidance to PIs on crafting stronger BI plans. ARIS's BI plan rubric was suggested as a starting resource. Rewarding PIs who make progress on BI and penalizing PIs who do not. Requiring PIs to submit progress towards BI goals in the annual report in a more robust and thorough manner. And removing novelty as a requirement for BI and encouraging PIs to align with existing BI programs and initiatives. I will note that just before we move forward, I'll note that while the second merit review principle states that BI activities can be based on innovative and/or established approaches, the second merit review element, in contrast to the principle, states to what extent do the proposed activities suggest and explore creative, original, or potentially transformative concepts. This may be what respondents are in fact reacting to. Okay, now we can go to the next slide. With regard to institutional support for BI, this was another emerging theme, with participants expressing varying degrees of support for BI from their institutions. They suggested that institutions of a higher education do an inadequate job, if at all, at tracking and documenting the impact of BI, whether at the PI, the departmental, or the institutional level. This lack of tracking was perceived to be connected to a downplaying of societal impacts in promotion and tenure packages. There was also a general opinion that NSF does not sufficiently hold institutions accountable for their institutional capacity building around BI. ARIS respondents also highlighted that NSF is in a strong position to lead the BI conversation across federal agencies. So there is alignment of language and requirements of BI. Next. Some suggestions for NSF to encourage institutional support of BI include leading a federal-wide conversation about standardization on BI definitions, evaluation, and accountability. Leading salient conversations with university chancellors, provosts, and presidents about how to include BI in promotion, tenure reviews, and institutional BI capacity needs, particularly at smaller universities that have more barriers to executing BI initiatives. Highlighting opportunities to build BI capacity within institutions that lack or have diminished BI infrastructure. It's to be noted, as we discussed earlier, I think at the May 8th meeting, that Granted is a new program designed to build capacity in emerging research institutions. Alicia may be able to speak to whether or not it supports BI capacity building as well. Next. We also heard quite a bit about partnerships and collaborations as a means to BI success. There was general agreement that productive partnerships are key to properly assessing impact of awards in the years that follow. Many participants expressed frustration at the roles community partners tend to be limited to as research subjects or participants in projects rather than experts in their community domains. Such limitations could lead to proposals that may not meet the needs of those communities in question and often result in minimal follow-through on outcomes as researchers move on to other investigations, often referred to as parachute research. Next. To incentivize meaningful collaborations, respondents suggested that NSF include BI experts and use their knowledge on all review panels. NSB passed a resolution, as many recalled, in 2021 to add BI experts on COV panels, which NSF is piloting right now. The Committee on Oversight expects to receive an update on this pilot soon. Secondly, to incentivize the integration of community partners as co-PIs in research and as reviewers on review panels. And then mandate that community partners and stakeholders have a voice in reporting on the impact of investigations, along with tangible rewards to incentivize that participation. Next. Another prominent theme was guidance and training. Participants suggested that current guidance for BI project development is vague. They stated a need for better guidance to proposers and reviewers and more BI expertise on review panels, as we mentioned a moment ago. They also expected and noted that by the time impacts of most BI interventions are apparent, award funding is usually exhausted, making outcome evaluation difficult. Respondents believe this point should be factored into NSF's budget guidance so that resources are available to conduct evaluations and assessment of activities and outcomes. Respondents also urged NSF to decline proposals with inadequate budgets for BI. Furthermore, several participants noted inconsistencies across the agency, that is NSF itself, resulting in the perception that certain NSF programs or directorates prioritize BI more than others. Participants were interested in understanding how BI funding and outcomes differs by directorate. The next slide. To improve BI guidance, participants suggested NSF provide clearer budgeting expectations for BI activities and evaluation. That is, how much of an award should be spent on BI. Develop standardized proposal review and selection protocols across the agency, which may require improved training for NSF staff, and ensure equitable demographic representation of experts on review panels whenever possible. Next. Finally, on the theme of accessibility and dissemination, we heard participants encourage the dissemination of findings from BI activities, both throughout the scientific community and throughout communities most impacted by the research. There was also a call for attention to accessibility of resources and products across diverse communities and standardization across directorates, which could in turn make information easier to share. Next slide. Specifically, participants suggested NSF ensure that all resources related to research activity meet accessibility guidelines as detailed in the web content accessibility guidelines. And then finally, in conclusion, while participants showed clear support for the continuance of the broader impacts criterion, they offered several areas for improvement to strengthen the impact of the criterion. Being focused on the policy phase of our reexamination, I think it's important to note that policy suggestions called out here, including standardization of the BI criterion guidance across the agency, addressing novelty in the BI criterion, and to expand the focus given to evaluation plans and budgets for BI in proposal evaluation. Then inclusion, expansion of community partnerships on proposals, for example, as co-PIs, on review panels, and in conversations of outcome. Again, we're very glad to have Susan here with us to provide an opportunity for us to hear directly from these experts. And thank you to the commission and board office staff for supporting Steve and me during this listening session. I'll turn it back to you, Steve.
Thank you very much, Wanda. Before we move on, Susan, do you have any thoughts about the session and our report and what we heard?
Absolutely. So first of all, thank you for coming to the summit. It means a lot to the AIRS community to have the NSF and the NSB come and want to hear from us. So that went a long way with our community. So thank you for that. There was nothing that I heard at the listening session or that I heard just now that I thought was surprising. It's conversations we've been having for a long time. So I'm excited to get to our conversation today to hear what you all think about that.
Thank you. So earlier this month, we heard a desire to understand the intention behind aggregation of societal outcomes. We touched on the concept of novelty and broader impacts. We heard a need for clarification regarding the intended audience and audiences for the criteria, elements, and principles. Having heard the findings of the BI expert listening session, we have a better idea of what practitioners, those who are on the ground engaging with the policy, see as strengths and opportunities for the criteria. So let's use the remainder of our time discussing areas for potential examination. Remember, these discussions will inform future data collection questions and commission agendas. This is your opportunity to shape the work plan. So think about what you want to know about broader impacts criterion and what do you see as a priority to address. Are there any initial thoughts? Otherwise, I can sort of seed the conversation with some of those 4 elements that I identified in my opening.
Julia has a hand up.
Sorry, Julia?
Yeah, thanks very much, Steve. So there were just a couple of things, and I think that kind of popped to the top of my head, and they fit into the general category of the tension between bottoms up and top down. One of them that I hadn't really thought about before, I probably wasn't sufficiently familiar, that Wanda brought up was the difference across directorates, and I imagine probably even across programs, in terms of the way in which broader impact is interpreted and potentially even the seriousness with which it is taken. I think that is a very high priority for the foundation to deal with. You know, it's known as walking the talk, right? And so that is at the foundation level. The other thing that I wonder about is, you know, there is in the Diligent book the chart of the various kinds of broader impacts, and that's probably not even completely inclusive. And I can understand how large proposals, centers, and potentially facilities and the like might have a reasonably coherent and, you know, complete approach to broader impacts in a particular area. What I wonder about is when one requires each principal investigator type of proposal to have a broader impact section, and presumably you are looking for the strength of those that part of the proposal as well as the other merits of the proposal. How does one look across the portfolio and try to make sure that you cover at least a reasonable fraction of the waterfront in terms of the types of broader impacts? You don't want every single proposal focusing on, I don't know, public communication, just to take a random example. You want it spread across, I think, those different things. And so how one does that, and you know, what's the balance between that and letting 1,000 flowers bloom, I think is at least a question in my mind.
Yeah, Alicia is going to have her team give us a presentation at our next meeting about how the system does work, which I think is something that we urgently need. Alicia, would you care to answer Julia's question as well as give any reactions to our listening session in Baltimore?
Well, I appreciate the culmination of all of these different comments. In the slides, Wanda showed a couple of the word clouds. I feel like that the group really answered some of the prompts using the word cloud function as a very engaging way of getting information. And so one thing that I found interesting in these slides here was the progression of comments via word cloud to actual statements, which people also typed out via prompts and so on. So it's good to see these comments firsthand. I think overall what it suggests to me are a few things. One is having and Susan and I have talked about this, having an overview within the ARIS community about the 2 review criteria that NSF uses and how BI professionals have a role to play in translating broader impacts more effectively with the faculty and other investigators that they're working with during the development of a proposal. We've also talked about BI professionals being included as reviewers. And during the conference, I shared that as part of the Granted initiative, that we've done a broad call out to various communities in the research enterprise. These are support functions, part of the backbone and infrastructure that supports all the investigators and the work that they do. We asked for people to volunteer to be reviewers for Granted. And so in the ARIS meeting, I shared with the community that they can volunteer to be reviewers, and that's still an open opportunity. Granted at nsf.gov/granted has a link where people can volunteer to be reviewers. We have added through that function over 500 new reviewers to NSF. So having a big broad call where people feel like, oh, I didn't know NSF could use my expertise. We absolutely could use BI expertise and want to consider, or we want those BI professionals to consider volunteering to be reviewers. That helps us diversify our reviewer base. Within NSF, making sure that program officers know that there are BI professionals in the reviewer data set so that they can go and find them. That's something that's sort of on me and other people within NSF to raise awareness around. But I want to go back to one comment I heard Julia say around the differences, the way BI is implemented across the directorates. And this is an important area that I think we want to talk about as we talk about implementation. So part of what is the value of the criteria is that it sets up for all of NSF to see the criteria and add flexibility for various disciplines, various projects, various investigators who have very different experiences, different resources, to still be able to do broader impacts, even if they're not in an R1 institution, or that they don't have an institutional broader impact center, or that they're an early career faculty member. This is the policy, or the way in which we set up the criteria, is really about allowing people to access the merit review process through intellectual merit and broader impacts. The way in which disciplines build up their own perspectives and experiences around broader impacts, in my opinion, should remain a disciplinary opportunity. We shouldn't make everyone try to do broader impacts the exact same way across all disciplines. We don't do that for science. We shouldn't do it for broader impacts. So there's lots to discuss in this regard, but I do think that what I heard at ARIS was a number of people who are growing in their expertise around their knowledge of NSF, and we could probably do more to help bring context around broader impacts.
If I could just respond to that last bit, because I've seen this in other organizations in related areas, and when one gets too far down over on the side of, yes, let the individual organization, the individual discipline decide what's right for them, clearly that's right to a point. On the other hand, minimizing the importance of it is not an option, and I think that needs to be really clear. And that there needs to be a substantive conversation as to what the expectations are, and honestly, what the consequences are if they aren't met.
Thank you, Julia. Any other thoughts before I move on to prompt the discussion in certain ways? Okay, one of the things that Wanda mentioned was there is a bit of a disconnect potentially between one of the criteria and one of the principles regarding is novelty to be something that we expect in broader impact presentations. Certainly novelty is something we generally expect in the intellectual merit. Is there a strong interest in promoting novelty, or sometimes is more better? Julia?
Okay, well, at the risk of monopolizing, which I really don't want to do, I think it's really clear that there are some approaches, for example, in K-12 education, which we've spent quite a bit of time, diving into. There are some approaches that are known to work, and if they are known to work, and there is a particularly significant issue to be addressed, by all means, those, propagation of those known good approaches should be rewarded. And so, doesn't mean you're not open to new ideas, but if other things work and can be implemented in places that they are not currently implemented, by all means, go for it.
I tend to agree with that very much. I think the key is to make sure that it is appreciated and it is evaluated and people are held accountable, but more is better, in my opinion. Are there any other thoughts on that?
Dr. Reno has a hand up.
Yes, sorry.
I promise I won't try to monopolize, but you know that I will have an answer for every question that you ask.
Good.
But in this one in particular, I just want to bring the perspective from the BI community. We struggled for a long time working with researchers between that tension, because we would have researchers who would submit something that they knew worked, that had a great evidence base behind it, and the review panel would say it's not innovative enough. And then we'd have researchers who would come up with really innovative things that could really move the needle that we might want to try. And the review panel would come back and say, where's the evidence base for this? How do you know this will work? And so we were really pleased when the PAPG added that section in there where it talks about you can do either or, because we think it's really important. We absolutely want people to use best practice. There is best practice out there, particularly when you're working with partners and communities. And as you mentioned, K-12, but still give researchers the ability to be creative and think in different ways, just like they do with their science.
Thank you.
Might that suggest at the policy level, I really appreciate your comment on that, Susan. Might that suggest at the policy level some reconciliation between the principle and the element for us to consider, so that we're consistent at both the principle and element level?
Okay.
Say that later, Steve. We want to move forward.
All right. How about the subject of societal outcomes? Are there specific desired societal outcomes that we think BI should focus on? The 2010 task force on merit review, our predecessors highlighted two areas. One was improved well-being of individuals and enhanced infrastructure. The 2010 Competes Act did not talk about whether there should be priorities in broader impacts. Our 2030 vision report potentially could be said to call out some broader impacts goals. What do we think about whether there should be encouragement for particular kinds of societal impacts goals as opposed to benefit of society. Kayvon.
Thank you. So this is an opinion that I expressed when we met in person earlier this month. I am beginning to develop a fairly strong opinion about this. It seems to me that if the board, is going to articulate, components of a vision, as we have in Vision 2030, and some components of that vision are articulated in terms of very specific societal impact goals, the missing millions, geography of innovation, et cetera. It seems to me that there ought to be a way to at least explicitly invite proposers to connect their broader impacts work and goals and objectives to those specific board articulated vision components. I don't know that I would go so far as to say require. It seems to me that over time, as board priorities and vision components evolve and change and adjust, you wouldn't want to completely torque the BI requirements. But it seems to me that there ought to be a mechanism by which board vision components and priorities can be reflected in the invitation and the call for proposers to respond via their broader impacts. It's my view. Essentially a stronger explicit connection to board articulate vision components.
Okay. Scott.
Thanks, Steve. With regards to if there are particular societal impacts that we wanted to emphasize, within the administration pushing, particular subsets, I guess, of the criteria, we are on the hook through the legislation to report on all these. So I think we need to be careful of emphasizing some at the expense of others, because when it comes time to actually reporting on our progress, it's like, okay, we emphasize these, but we decided to ignore, these others. So I can certainly see a flavor to it. Certainly there's a nice plan with the number of graduate students, where they're coming from, other populations that we need to tap into. That has a nice closure with Vision 2030, for example. But if we emphasize to the extent that we just simply haven't addressed some of the other criterion, I think we might be getting ourselves into trouble.
Okay, thank you. Alicia?
So somewhat coming back to Kayvon's statement about inviting proposals to speak to particular things that the NSB wants to articulate. So in my firsthand experience in helping investigators prepare ideas for funding, and I've done this for a very long time, I've seen a lot of different interpretations of broader impacts in the way that NSF communicates about broader impacts. And what we have now is in our proposal, our PAPG, Proposal and Award Policies and Procedures Guide, we have a list of 10 suggestions for broader impacts. And it says, these are not exhaustive. This is not a complete list. These are just suggestions. And the way in which those get changed every year now, we have a new PAPG. So there's an opportunity to make those suggestions, updated, changed, or whatever. But we know that most of the time, people prefer to focus their broader impacts on workforce development and broadening participation. So again, if people look at that list and say, these are the only ideas I can do for broader impacts, that's a misperception. That's not correct. And what we want to do is educate people to know that there are all sorts of things that they can bring up for broader impacts. And I prefer when investigators develop what is called in the community a broader impacts identity. a holistic, long-term view to doing broader impacts, not just one proposal at a time and change it up every time and so on, that they actually commit to something and they build it up much like their research program. That's what I think makes the most sense. That's what I prefer. That's how I used to help faculty do things. But people can change, and that's the utility and the flexibility that we have here. And I can't reinforce that enough. Flexibility is great in this, the way we've set things up, to allow people to explore and contribute to this broader impact on society in a lot of different ways. Now, again, we can provide suggestions and we can provide the education that these are just suggestions and all sorts of things are welcome. But we do also have to train reviewers. We have to train program officers. We have to help people understand that there's a plethora of opportunities here that can be spelled out. So I don't know how much energy should be spent coming up with new suggestions every year, or, again, explaining things in different ways. And that's the part, this is the point of the commission, is to talk about this sort of thing and whether we're going to be disruptive in good ways that actually change things for the better, or if we're just kind of stirring the pot and nothing's necessarily going to result in broad impact.
Thank you, Julia.
Yeah, I actually like Kayvon's comment a lot, and there might actually be a middle path. I would assert that if you have 10 priorities, you sort of have no priorities. And so actually saying they are all equally important and equally encouraged, I think is a disservice. And the other thing is there are quite a few, I believe, proposers who haven't proposed before, or maybe haven't proposed successfully and may be floundering and looking for the right thing. It's not a bad idea to point them in particular directions that we are especially interested in. One possible middle ground might be something like referring to strategy documents such as Vision 2030 and even the NSF strategy as things that shape the overall portfolio, including in broader impact. Sure, you can propose in any of these things. These are the areas we are especially interested in getting great ideas on.
Susan, do you have a view on this?
Absolutely. So a couple of things I just want to mention is that, we spoke a lot to some of the former task force members, so your predecessors, about broader impacts. In fact, a couple of them are BI champions this year. And one of the things they talked about was really intentionally not being prescriptive, really leaving that open for flexibility. And when I talk to researchers, one of the things that I say is that if you look at those 10 areas, there's almost nothing you can't do within that, right? So I think there's a strength in that NSF is leaving that open and flexible. One of the things I will mention, to echo what Alicia said, is a lot of times our researchers tend to focus on the top half of that list, particularly broadening participations, K-12, K-16, all the way through lifelong learning, globally competitive workforce. Workforce is coming to the front because of Vision 2030. We had our Broader Impact Summit 2 years ago focused on workforce development because we wanted to be aligned with Vision 2030. I will say that a lot of our researchers and that the BI professionals sometimes struggle seeing themselves as an agent of workforce development until we started reframing that and thinking about that in longer terms. So I think that there are opportunities to rework maybe some of them, collapse them, maybe bring them together, but I really like the flexible nature of it. One of the things that I will just mention is that it's frustrating to reviewers, frustrating to researchers and the BI professionals who help them when you put forth a broader impacts plan that addresses one of the areas that you see in those top 10, but it feels like the review panels review what they wish was there, not was actually in front of them. So many times we see reviewers who say, well, this is really great over here, but you didn't do broadening participation. Currently, right now, BI does not equal broadening participation unless it's a solicitation specific requirement. And so a lot of times we see people who will propose things somewhere within this general flexibility, but because someone comes into it with a preconceived notion about what they think is the most important, if they don't see it, researchers feel like that reviews them negatively and then they don't get funded. So just something to keep in mind is that if the flexibility is really good, but if there are preconceived notions about what is best, and that's coming through in the reviews, and then that causes frustration with the researchers.
Julia?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we are fundamentally different. I don't think anybody's talking about narrowing the ideas that will be considered. That is the job of choosing the right members of the panel and making sure that the panels are run in such a way that all of the meritorious ideas are fully considered. When I don't think that is necessarily in conflict with the sorts of things that we are talking about here.
Why do we think there is a perception of persistent misunderstandings around the broader impacts criteria?
So Steve, I'll just jump right in. So if I were addressing this from a sort of a scientific perspective, I don't think we have evidence that there's this broad misperception. I think that there's anecdotal evidence for sure. Yeah. But, we want to ask a question, and I know that some of this conversation will help inform additional inquiry that we do in more formal ways. So I want to kind of put this out here in that sort of way, is that we want to ask the right question to get to potential solutions that will really help us. And people misperceiving or misunderstanding what broader impacts are it's unfortunate. It happens. Yes. Is it on a broad scale? I don't know. I don't have evidence for that. And could we, to some of the suggestions that were made and shown by the slides earlier, are there institutional solutions that could help? Are there ways in which building up capacity to work with investigators who are building proposals and submitting them, a way in which to help people not misunderstand, but instead create really strong broader impacts identities? I think that's really what ERIS is trying to build, that capability. And as you saw in the ERIS data from the participants from the ERIS Summit, a lot of people are at well-resourced R1 institutions. So part of what NSF is very committed to is really trying to help bring forward greater capacity for being successful with external funding across all types of institutions and organizations that participate and want to participate in NSF funding. And so we're committed to doing that, but it's also a workforce challenge as well. There's not, the BI professionals have found their jobs mostly accidentally. People don't go to college to become a BI professional. So some of the same things that we see over and over and over again across all of the research enterprise also pertains to broader impacts. So I think if we're going to try to address the broader impacts misperceptions, we're actually trying to address all of the potential misperceptions that people have when they don't have a background in understanding how to gain funding or apply to NSF or any other federal agency for that matter.
That's a really good point. Julia?
Yeah, I think what a lot of what we're dealing with is the fact that you have people who come through the entire educational system, they find themselves in a tenure track position, and suddenly they are writing their own proposals and they have to do this thing called broader impacts that they have had, most of them have had minimal exposure to in their entire educational career. And so between the fact that you have a population of people writing these proposals who don't really know much about this aspect, and they're very comfortable with the science and proposing that. So there's a huge disconnect there. And the fact that many of the institutions at least give the impression, according to what Wanda said, and it's quite believable to me, that many of the institutions are sort of ambivalent about it, or at least, you know, will definitely put the weighting over on the science and the research side, as opposed to the broader impact side. So you don't have a culture that values this or even has a clue of where to start unless you dive in. And so I think, you know, I'm not quite sure how far our remit goes down into that cultural aspect, but I do think it's important, and I think we should not remain silent on it.
Candace, you had, sorry, Susan, but Candace, you had a comment?
I do. I'm happy to go after Susan, though. Sorry, I didn't mean to jump in here.
No, I didn't know if you were following in on this.
No, I have I mean, it's related, but not a direct follow-up.
Please, Candace, go in front of me. I'm happy to wait.
Okay, thank you, Susan. I just wanted to make the point that we don't want to equate the idea of a broader impact professional with someone who is exclusively interested in workforce development or education. There's you know, we've been talking about how broader impacts are indeed very, very broad. There are a lot of examples, and we don't want to dismiss the importance of all of those other elements of broader impacts, especially, you know, things we have a whole directorate now that's interested in translation and partnerships and other things that are very important with respect to broader impact and societal relevance. So, and many of those things are very intertwined with the intellectual merit and the science. So just wanted to keep that on the table.
Thank you. Susan?
I just want to respond to what Candace said really quickly, and you're absolutely right. Part of the goal of ERIS is to help those who are supporting researchers and researchers understand all the areas of broader impact. So many of them think that what they can do is so small, and actually what we do is tell them the world is big, and our job is to help you figure out, along with what Alicia said, your BI identity. What's that thing that you really want to do that integrates with your research and works well? In fact, NSF is supporting a workshop on use-inspired research that a lot of our participants are going to help them understand what broader impact looks like in a use-inspired world. And so we're really excited about that. Stephen, I don't know if you could read my mind, but the questions that you're asking of the list of questions are the ones that I think are the most important. And this one right here is the one that we could write a dissertation on, that we could spend a lot of time talking about. So a couple of things. One is that when we started doing this work over 10 years ago, there was a lot of the same critiques that things weren't being implemented across the board in the same way. There was a lot of frustration. And when we voiced those frustrations to NSF, one of the things we heard is NSF is us, meaning that you have a lot of rotators who come from institutions, you have reviewers who are researchers who propose to that. And if you look at what NSF is doing, a lot of that happens from people who are coming from research institutions. If we want to make a difference in how that gets done at the NSF level, we need to work at the institutional and individual level. So if you look at the resources that NABI and now ERIS has put towards broader impacts, a lot of it focuses on the institutional level and the individual level, helping them understand what broader impacts is, how to do it, how to evaluate it well, looking at institutions and how to do that. So I think that's really important. One of the things that we heard, and it is anecdotal, but we hear a lot of times that this is the National Science Foundation. It's not the National Broader Impacts Foundation. And I have a history in archaeology. I'm a history nerd. I love that so much that I read all the iterations of the PAPPG. I know that we have an NSF historian, which sounds like the best job in the world. And he wrote a really great article on the merit review process. And when we started going back and reading the original documents from FDR to Vannevar Bush about this idea of what we're going to build for a National Science Foundation, one of the things FDR asked was make sure that you get the information that you are learning from the research into the public as soon as you can. because there's a distrust between the public after the science and the war and other things. So he is asking them before the foundation to start getting it out to the public. If you look at what NSF has funded in the past, within the first 2 years of NSF's founding, they were funding what we think of as broader impacts activities. Things like a GRFP, so graduate research fellowships, training the next generations of scientists. By the second year, they were already understanding that math teachers were the gateway to science. And so they were doing teacher workshops from high school math teachers to get them to know better science to be able to help the next generation. NSF was supporting the National Science Fair. So the things that we think of as broader impacts have been part of the fabric of the foundation since its beginning. And so part of it, I think, goes back to what Julia said at the beginning. It's about valuing both of the criteria equally. And if you read what the principles and the merit review guidelines say, if you read them and take them to heart, it says you're supposed to do both of those things well. That they are the things that we judge proposals on, and we want them to do them well. Someone asked me in the last conversation whether or not it was okay to, whether we should fund things that are okay in the science, but really good in broader impacts. And I said, absolutely not. What I want the NSF to fund is things that are excellent in broader impacts and excellent in intellectual merit. So just some things to think about. I'm excited about the way the conversation is going. And I think if we understand the history and where this is going and towards the future, I think that would be really great. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you to everyone for an excellent discussion. Today's conversation has provided useful input for staff as they plan additional listening sessions and meeting agendas. In the meantime, please continue thinking about broader impacts and the way it is grounded in the agency's mission. Again, generally, we'll be talking about policy, then we'll go to implementation, then we'll go to accountability as we go through our year together. Our next meeting is scheduled for June 14th, and we'll use part of that time discussing proposed agenda topics for the next several meetings, which we will circulate prior to the meeting. In addition, Alicia, as mentioned before, has graciously agreed to lead a discussion on the merit review process. While we're initially focused on policy, I think a better understanding of the basics of merit review process, as well as responsible personnel and offices throughout the process, will better inform our policy work. We look forward to hearing how current policy shapes the implementation of this process. Finally, for those watching, we welcome your general suggestions and your inquiries. Please contact us at meritreviewcommission@nsf.gov. And to learn more about activities regarding this reexamination, visit nsf.gov/NSB. Thank you again for a productive meeting. We conclude this meeting at 12:59 today. Thank you very much for your time.